am Emily Cockayne, Associate Professor of Cultural History at the University of East Anglia. I'm also the author of 4 books, the most recent of which being Penning Poison, A History of Anonymous Letters, published in 2023, which I'm going to talk to you about today as part of the York Festival of Ideas. We're going to think about the power of unsigned letters. So I'm going to start with this letter. It's the letter I opened Penning Poison with. And it was a letter sent in 1894 to Mary Dorothea Cockayne, no relation to me, the wife of the genealogist George Cockayne, who wrote the complete peerage. Now, the couple were about to bury their son, Morton Willoughby, who at 28 had died of complications from typhoid fever. Morton had been the curate of All Saints parish in Carshalton, and the note reads, "Perhaps in a trance or coma, don't bury yet. The other curate was reported dead some time since." Why would anybody send a grieving mother such a note? It feels a little like the ghoulish behaviour of people who LOL, lolling on the internet at people beset by misfortunes. Was it designed to wound? Was it actual advice? I explore in Penning Poison various contexts for this letter, probing the Cockayne family history, but ultimately it is unresolved. I could not be sure who sent it, although there is a possible suspect who I will introduce you to later. Note that it has a Sutton postmark. Now, for me, the more interesting question is, why did Mary keep such a note like this? Surely a note like this would make her very sad. So why would she keep such negative energy around her? And so in researching Penning Poison, I wanted to think about these various questions. So who might have written the letters? What was the context for sending the letter? And what could have been the reaction of the receiver? Now, I found that generally it was impossible to discover certain answers to all 3 of the questions. But before we move on, let's ask, what was an anonymous letter? Well, it was a note or a postcard or a letter or a parcel enclosure that was unsigned, or that it was signed by a pseudonym or a symbol, but basically it was a letter with an unknown author. For Penning Poison, I focused on letters written between 1760 and 1939, focusing on letters sent to unsettle the receiver, perhaps for some revenge purposes, or to threaten them or blackmail them, or simply to spread gossip. So until I had written Penning Poison, very little attention had been paid to British anonymous letters beyond a few specific case studies of very specific letter campaigns, specifically the Edalgy letters of the late 19th century and also letters circulating in Littlehampton in the 1920s. Part of the reason for this lack of historical interest is that the research is very complicated. There are few letters in most county archives, but they're not always very well catalogued, and they're not always very easy to find. Most historians work systematically through a series of documents in an archive, but this was not possible for this project. I had to consult documents in more than 24 archives, and this took me more than 10 years to complete. And meanwhile, I wrote a whole other book as well, Rummage, the history of recycling, because I could double up the archival work for both books. Now, it's impossible to even guess at the number of anonymous letters sent between 1760 and 1939, as most of them would have very likely been destroyed and been just chucked away. This means that the surviving samples that we can look at if we want to look at anonymous letters must be atypical. And this is a problem that I needed to bear in mind as I researched the book. So here is the basic categorization of letters that I used for Penning Poison. I categorized the letter types in these very basic ways. So tip-offs, whistleblowing, that sort of thing, dobbing. Often sent about officials or authority figures, but also often sent to them. Threats, obscene letters, libellous letters, gossipy letters, and hate mail. Now, in researching the book, I found that the majority of the letters I looked at actually defied these simplistic categories. So a letter that might appear to be a tip-off might also operate as a threat, for example. A gossipy letter might also just be blackmail. Some letters were just cranky and they don't really fit in any category at all very well. Now, the bottom three categories here have more available material in the official record because they tap into specific statute laws. And for the investigation of those letters, it was often imperative to prove that somebody had posted the letter, not that they had written it. So posting an obscenity or a threat or a libel was regarded to have published it and therefore made it prosecutable in law. If there was no specific threat, no obvious obscenity, or no libelous content, then a letter would probably be ignored. It wouldn't be shown to the police or anybody. So those letters were likely to be underrepresented in the surviving historical samples. I started the project in the 1760s because I wanted to have handwritten letters that revealed interpersonal relationships at all levels of society. And before then, the rates of literacy being very low meant that you only really got letters sent between elites or blackmailing elites, sort of ransom letters. This is the sort of thing that I really wanted to look at in the book. I wanted to look at how these letters can tell us something about the underlying relationships more generally. I stopped shy at 1940, as the period after them was complicated by burgeoning methods of anonymous dispatch, things like telegrams and telephones, and also very much later, obviously, the internet. Additionally, the study of anonymous letters involves probing secrets. There was often a grain of truth to the "I know what you did last summer" sort of comment, those accusations. And so many anonymous letters attack the reputations of their receivers. And I didn't want to re-victimize any living receivers of anonymous hate. So hence the reason at cutting short at 1940. So let's think of the first category that we're going to look at. We're going to look at the gossip of the Georgian and the late Georgian and the early 19th century, Georgian period in the early 19th century. And here's a letter sent to Major Elliot in 1829, and it reads, "Sir, a gentleman on Blackheath has just returned from Brighton, where he heard a certain lady spread a report that your sister's two maiden ladies were kept out of charity by General Man, and that your family endeavours to marry into families and to live and sponge on them." And so I've got a copy of this letter. That this is what they would have looked like. So you'd have opened the seal. So the Major Elliot would have opened the seal and read this, and you think, what would he have felt about looking at a letter like this? How would he have felt about this? So Major Elliot, let's give it some context. Major Elliot was a retired army man, and at the time he was married to, but estranged from, his second wife, Anne. And the General Man mentioned in the letter was the father of his first wife, Harriet. So this gossipy letter itself tells of gossip overheard in the fashionable circles of Brighton, where a certain lady is claiming that Major Elliot's unmarried sisters, Eliza and Anne Katerina, were sponging off General Man's hospitality. So did a little bit of sleuthing, and it turns out that the certain lady overheard gossiping was almost certainly his estranged wife, Anne, who in 1929 did indeed live in Brighton. This is not especially nasty gossip, and so what would the motive have been to send a letter like this to Major Elliot? Was the letter trying to gain something by rubbing the Major's nose in this gossip, or did they genuinely want to the Major to know so he could take positive steps and take action against it? We cannot know at this historical distance. We can only pose these possible questions for this sort of letter. Now, the next category of letter I'd like to look at is whistleblowing. And here we have a tip-off letter from 1849, and this letter took the longest to sleuth of all in the book. I shall read it. I'm not going to do it with the appropriate West Midlands accent, however. So, Master Heberard, you look after those butchers and softly Jack at Moor Lane. they be very near Master Honeybourne's garden, if not under. You must not give them any notice before sending anyone down their pit. If you do, they will stop up their roads and cheat you. And it's signed Veritas. It means truth. Okay, so this letter appears in a chapter in Penning Poison about letters sent in the West Midlands in the mid to late 19th century. And the letter, sent in 1849, warns about the nefarious activities of two coal masters, who have here the pseudonyms in the letter Butchers and Softly Jack. It took quite a lot of searching to find out, but the backstory of this is that two coal masters, two Josephs, Joseph Higgs and Joseph Darby, were undermining. So they were digging coal out from under the land of this area here, Master Honeybourne's garden, that was currently the location of a glassworks. The Master Heberard it is addressed to is Mr. Eberard, who is the manager of that glassworks. Undermining, so coal dug out from under the ground, can cause subsidence. So the now destroyed famous Crooked Pub in Himley that was burnt down last year was the victim of subsidence. It's in this area, and the glassworks on Honeybourne's garden were actually very wonky too. They had lots of subsidence there. There are 3 pseudonyms in this letter. So it's signed by a pseudonym, Veritas, and then we've got Butchers and Softly Jack. And so Veritas, suggesting truth, warns the manager to check up on the activities of Butchers and Softly Jack. Now, Eberard would probably have opened this and known immediately who these people were. But it took me ages to find out that they were very likely local nicknames for this pair, Joseph Higgs and Joseph Darby, due to some past family stories involving brutal murders and also a highway robber from Rowley Regis called Rowley Jack. Putting all this together and having a very rare moment of happenstance in the archive when a document was inserted strangely in a place that it shouldn't be, that basically said, yes, you're correct, that these are the people who were Butchers and Softly Jack, but it took a very long time to get to that point. Okay, I'm going to issue a content warning for the next slide. If you don't like bad language, skip forward a couple of minutes at the end of this slide, because the next slide is very much not safe for work, because we're now moving into the category that is obscenity. Obscenity is tricky to define. I am far from the first to point this out. We can safely say that most historic obscene letters were written by men and sent to women. However, through researching Penning Poison, I can also suggest that not very much attention was drawn to these letters, these obscene letters written by men, unless they were combined with very determined stalking or specific attempts to meet and therefore debauch the victim. And then when these were obvious in the letters, then there were often police stings that caught the author. Let's give you some figures here. So in 1904, the Nottingham Post Office claimed to handle over 100 obscene postcards every week. So that's quite a lot. Until 1890, the overwhelming majority of obscene letters or postcards that were mentioned in the newspapers were written by men. And if these men were tried, they often peddled various excuses to excuse their writing of these anonymous obscene letters. And in Penning Poison, I include some of these actual excuses. So one of them said, I had the flu. Another said, I suffer from heart disease. One said, I was mesmerized. Another said, I'm addicted to morphine. And one, and this is my favorite, said, I can't write letters like this. I'm far too respectable to have written letters like this. This is from a case in Uttoxeter in 1939. And when asked why, what evidence the man had that he was too respectable to have written obscene letters like this, he said, I have been to Canada 3 times. This is seemingly accepted as a reason, and he wasn't convicted. Well, he was convicted, he was given a fine, but he wasn't sent to prison. I want you to bear that in mind when we think about some of the obscene letters that were written by women. after the 1890s. Now I'm going to move to the obscene letter, so do skip forwards a little bit if you don't want to read this. Okay, so here we have an obscene anonymous letter sent in Sutton in 1910 and attributed to Annie Tugwell. Annie Tugwell, born Irish, was the wife of the local registrar, so a very respectable member of the community and a mother of boys. This is one of the cleaner documents in the National Archive file on Tugwell, and it's one that does not have graphic sketches. I'm not going to read this one aloud. I'm going to leave it here. You can read it if you want to. Now, I'll give you the backstory to this one. Annie Tugwell was thought to have sent obscene libels like this between 1910 and 1913, but the police suspected that her career as an anonymous writer probably started around 1897 or earlier. Tugwell lived in Sutton in 1894 and is so a possible author of the letter to Mary Cockayne that I started the presentation with. Tugwell wrote these letters, so letters like this that we have here in 1910 in a really specific handwriting. They're in the handwriting of another Annie. They're in the handwriting of Annie Dewey. Annie Dewey was the housekeeper of Canon Cafferata, who was the local Roman Catholic priest, and Annie Tugwell had fallen out with him. What I want you to think about now is how Annie Tugwell used the handwriting of her minor enemy, nemesis, Annie Dewey, to write letters that besmirched the character of her major enemy, the Canon Cafferata. The local police fell for this decoy. They decide because it's a decoy because Annie Tugwell wrote letters to herself. And Annie Dewey was taken to court, and it was shown during her trial that she couldn't have written these letters. And so then the suspicion falls on Annie Tugwell. She becomes the obvious suspect. So I mentioned these are decoy letters. Decoy letters are sent to the writer themselves, or they include details about the writer designed to throw the police into assuming the innocence of that person. The police would go, why would this person write letters that have details about their own character in them? So Annie Tugwell's first conviction was in 1910, and it was for malicious and defamatory libels, and she was imprisoned at this time. Meanwhile, her husband Harry left her, and her episodes start again in 1913 with anonymous letters sent to her solicitor and also her sister-in-law. And her sister-in-law was one of the witnesses in the case in 1910 and was adamant that Annie didn't write the letters. And her sister-in-law was adamant again in 1913 that Annie had not written the letters. But the police were very determined to catch Annie Tugwell posting letters. Because remember, with letters like this, obscene libels, it wasn't that you'd written it that mattered, it's that you were publishing it, so posting it by publishing it. And so the local police force posted 3 policemen for 3 entire weeks in 1913 around the clock to watch Annie Tugwell in case she posted a letter. Overkill? Well, now, Annie was eventually found guilty again of writing anonymous letters, but the mystery thickens, and I'm a little dubious about Annie's overall guilt, or at least her guilt about writing all of the letters she's attached to from 1910 to 1913, because case notes from an asylum that she ended up in 1914 suggests very strongly that Annie Tugwell didn't write all of the letters because she received anonymous letters in the same vein while she was there, and that's recorded by the personnel of the asylum, not by Annie herself. So this is a mystery that continues. Who wrote Annie Tugwell's letters? Okay, moving to the next slide. In Penning Poison, I look at 105 single letters or letter campaigns. So letter campaigns are cases where there were more than one letter that was circulated in an area that appear to be written by the same person. Of these 105 letters, 65 were written to specific individuals and the rest were written to various institutions or to groups of people or couples. So if we break down the individuals by gender, we can see that 22 were sent to women and 43 were sent to men. However, it was really only in the early 20th century that letters with no clear threat to life or no arrangement to meet up in obscene letters or no clear blackmail were actually followed up. And in those cases, it was letters usually sent to women that formed the focus of police and press attention. It's also this time that the stereotype of the uptight spinster as poison pen letter writer starts to develop. Now, these are the types of gossipy letters circulating in tight-knit communities, the kind that were given space in Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers, and the term poison pen was developed in the 1910s and used a lot in the 1910s and the 1920s. Very particularly started to attach to female anonymous letter writing. I argue in Penning Poison that this isn't entirely fair, and it just means that more letters written by men at the time were ignored because they weren't as newsworthy, they weren't as sensational. Now let's have a look at what happens if we consider who wrote the letters and think about that with gender in mind. Well, I consider the development of anonymous letter writing broadly chronologically in Penning Poison. And whilst the first half of my book focuses therefore on letters written by men because of female literacy rates weren't as high, access to materials for women to write letters were not as available. Now, the second half of the book brings in very many more female authors. And I wanted to think about why this was the case. And especially after the 1890s, the media and the police obsession with female suspects absolutely magnifies until we get this developing of ideas in the 1910s and the 1920s. Indeed, I was able to dedicate a whole chapter around 5 female writers in the Weald area of southern England in the 1910s and 1920s. Most of these women wrote decoy letters like Annie Tugwell that threw a blame onto a very obvious suspect. And so they followed the same MO. It's interesting to think about whether they were copying the ideas in the newspapers. Let's have a think about the context of those letters, but we're going to start with a tip-off letter. It's actually a postcard jauntily written on this little Christmas postcard here. And so this appears in the chapter of based on these 5 cases in the Weald area. Now we get an entangling of the sort of tip-off letter that dobbed on members of the community to authorities. Just like this postcard sent in 1915 to the Hounslow sanitary inspector. And it reads, "Will the sanitary inspector, when he has time, have a look through 14 Myrtle Road?" And so sanitary inspectors, they were a little like modern environmental health officers, like people who work for the council who receive anonymous communications, complaints about nuisances, noises, animals, diseases, bad drains, that sort of thing. Now, they were aware, the officers who had these roles, they were aware that some of these complaints were vexatious or frivolous. It's not actually very clear why some of them were acted upon. Some of these complaints were acted upon and some were ignored. In 1920, a letter was sent to the NSPCC, reportedly, supposedly tipping them off about the ill treatment of one of the various children in the home of Rose Gooding. Rose Gooding lived on Weston Road in Littlehampton. Littlehampton is a sleepy seaside town on the West Sussex coast. It was the focus of a lot of press attention in the 1920s because of a now famous case, because of a film, Wicked Little Letters, now out on DVD. Spoiler alert now coming up. So if anyone is actually planning to see Wicked Little Letters and doesn't want to know who wrote the letters in that film, then I'm going to issue another fast forward a few minutes now warning. Okay, so briefly, let's talk about the story that happened in Littlehampton. So Rose Gooding and Edith Swan were neighbours in Littlehampton, and they had initially been friends. But in May 1920, Edith Swan falsely accused Rose of cruelty to one of the children in her household, this letter to the NSPCC. Shortly afterwards, Rose was accused of writing the obscene letters that were circulating in the town at the time. Some of these were sent to Edith Swan. So Edith Swan took this case to court, and Rose Gooding was found guilty of criminal libel, and she was imprisoned in Portsmouth. When she was released at Christmas, letters continued to circulate. The police thought it was very obvious who the writer is. Rose Gooding seems like the rough sort of person who would write these letters, lives in an odd household, must be a very obvious suspect. In one of these letters that came at this time, Edith Swan was called a whore. And in another one, the whole Swan family were described as a dirty, drunken lot. Now, the local police honed it down and thought, well, it's only really going to be these two people who could write it, Rose Gooding or Edith Swan. And Edith Swan was seen as very unlikely to write mucky letters. And very specifically because one letter was sent to her fiance, Bertie Boxall, over in Iraq, where he was a part of the army. And the letter that went to Bert Boxall said that his fiancée, Edith Swan, was pregnant with another man's child. So the police said, well, it couldn't be Edith Swan writing this. Why would a woman scupper her own relationship with this sort of letter? Therefore, they continue to focus their attention on Rose Gooding, who lived in a chaotic household. And if you look here, her handwriting is as chaotic as her household would have been. Very unlike the writing used in the anonymous letters that I've parked at the top here. Anyone should be able to see, just by having a glance at Rose's letter here, that she would not be able to have the sort of penmanship to write the style of letters, the style of writing that the letters circulating in Littlehampton were in. Nonetheless, nobody really paid attention to handwriting of women in these female cases where there was an obvious female suspect. It was just seen as, well, it's obvious who wrote this. And Rose was convicted a second time, and she was given 12 months in prison with hard labour, at which point she might have even been sewing mailbags. An appeal failed, but attracted the attention of the inspector George Nichols from the Met in summer 1921, and he thought Rose was innocent. And so if Rose was innocent, the only credible suspect was Edith Swan. Eventually, Rose was exonerated and given a measly £250 compensation for her wrongful conviction. Now, eventually, after a period of observation which saw a female police officer hiding in a florist's shed and saw incriminating blotting paper, so one sheet is on the slide here, discovered, then there was enough evidence against Edith Swan to take a case against her. But this case against her failed, and Edith Swan was acquitted due to very heavy steering from the judge. The judge could not believe that this respectable-seeming woman in the dock could have written letters like this. Eventually, a post office investigation branch known as the Men of Secrets, this shadowy group of people who were allowed to open post and look into post boxes, they became involved in the case, and they issued stamps marked with invisible ink, and they gave those to the local post office to distribute to people who were main suspects, including Edith Swan. One of the vital letters used as proof at this time was one sent to the local sanitary inspector. A periscope was placed in a pillar box. Remember that the police needed evidence of posting, not writing the letters. And so all these things were put in place to try and catch Edith Swan writing and posting these letters. This led to firm and incontrovertible evidence against Swan, and she was found guilty. This is the fourth court case to appear in Littlehampton, well, not in Littlehampton, the town, but in the area about these letters. 4 court cases. Eventually, the actual guilty woman was found guilty, and she was sentenced to 12 months in prison. same length of time that Rose was convicted for. So obviously Edith Swan got nothing for her obvious perjury. Now, this sounds like a pretty sensational story, but I look at these 5 cases in the Weald area and it's not the first of its kind. Because in the 1910s, Mary Johnson in Redhill was framed by her neighbour, Eliza Woodman. This case ran from 1912 to 1914, and Mary Johnson was also imprisoned more than once. And also police assumptions about the likely author. They thought it was more likely to be rough Mary, who was a greengrocer and had a husband who was illiterate. She was seen as the more likely, obvious suspect than the more respectable Eliza. And the police even mounted observations in Eliza's house where they were actually fooled by things that Eliza Woodman did. Again, in that case, from 1912 to 1914, there was no legal counsel for Mary Johnson and there was no handwriting analysis. Now, for me, we've got a couple of anonymous letters here still attached to the Littlehampton case. I'm just going to give you a second to have a look at these. And for me, the most interesting aspect of the case is these anonymous letters sent to the Home Office in 1922 and 1923. Now, this is the point in time that Rose Gooding and Littlehampton had been exonerated and compensated. But both letters argue that Rose Gooding was still most likely to be guilty. There were people very determined to carry on believing that the rough woman and not the respectable woman was the likely author of the anonymous letters. And I found in writing Penning Poison that it's really remarkable how some families and communities could just put letter writing episodes behind them. They could excuse the actual letter writer in these decoy cases when they were finally revealed, but seemingly still harboured suspicions against the person who'd been falsely accused early on. This happens with Mary Johnson. It happens with Rose Gooding. It happens in very many cases. It's almost like if there's enough for a suspicion to fall on them in the first place, then they must be the sort of person who would write these letters. Even when they're proven to be innocent of writing the letters, they were seen as being guilty locally. Okay, let's move to another category of letter. We're going to think about hate mail now. This is more the sort of idea that people would have about anonymous letters. It fits in with the ideas of anonymity and disinhibition that we get on the internet at the moment. So the letter we have here was one sent to Mary Stopes. Mary Stopes was a campaigner for women's rights and also eugenics, and it was sent to her in 1928. And this was shortly after the publication of her novel Love's Creation. Now, the letter refers to ideas from Mary Stopes' earlier book, Married Love, in 1918. And it was sent to her care of the Mothers Clinic in Holloway. And note here that the author is disgusted. I love the dash between the dis and disgusted to give emphasis here, and says at the end, after saying, don't write these dirty things, English people don't like them, go back home. Now, Mary Stopes was Scottish, so this is an example of sort of bigoted writing, a sense that, you're not welcome here. And I look in Penning Poison at other letters sent to other women in the public eye, people like Evelyn Underhill, and also Florence Nightingale received hate mail like this. And I also look at other people who got hate mail, like football players and football managers. This kind of sets up the understanding of anonymous mail that we have from the internet at the moment, the sense that people spill all their bile on below the line comments. This is the sort of thing that we have had 100 years and more before. Now, we have one of my favourite items of hate mail here. This is one of several items of hate mail received by the car manufacturer Herbert Austin in the 1930s, and I will read it. There's a little bit missing at the top, but I'm guessing it says, "Why are you?" So Why are you continually having your photo shown in the newspapers? Your face shows nothing to be proud of. It is a cruel, hard face, dishonest, satanic face, only a face which shows the man could stoop to rob other men's brains, as undoubtedly you did with the sunshine roof. You are a cad. For Lord's sake, stop exhibiting your photo. And if you note here on the address side, they've cut out from the newspaper one of the pictures of Herbert Austin's face from the newspapers and pasted it in on that side. How would Herbert Austin have felt when he received this piece of post? Other items of hate mail received by Herbert Austin make no sense at all. They're completely cranky. They're very strange, but this one does have a context that we can understand. So this was sent in 1935, and newspaper reports about a legal case against Herbert Austin, a case he was embroiled in from 1933 onwards, were circulating in the newspapers at the time. And this is why his face has always been shown in the newspapers. It's not really Herbert Austin's fault that his face is in the newspapers. Now, this legal case was brought about by Edward Ernest Lewis, who sued him, claiming that Austin had stolen his design for the sunshine roof. So here we have the sunshine roof mentioned. What we mean here is what turned into the sunroof. And Austin had a patent for the sunroof that was this was challenged by Edward Ernest Lewis. And so this is what this letter, this postcard, is referring to. But it's one of many cases that I look at in Penning Poison that was triggered by newspapers, both local and national, drawing attention to specific stories. And then a person reading those newspaper accounts would take pen to paper and write to the person who was involved in these cases, write them an anonymous letter. And I see this as them wanting to get involved in the sort of global national debates, arguments, discussions, but they don't really have a place at the table. So they insert themselves into currents of discussion at the time, whilst they don't really feel that they belong enough to sign their names. So they want to have their ideas heard, but they don't really want to put a name to those ideas. Okay, now I'm going to look at another item of hate mail, this one received by a judge, and it looks like this. So it's in one of these prepaid postcards or postal attachments. It's addressed on one side, and then you peel it open, and the letter is on the other side. And so judges received a lot of anonymous tip-offs, but here is something different. It's a piece of hate mail sent to a judge about a legal decision he had made. And so, written on a prepaid letter card, these words were sent to Godfrey Russell Vick, King's Counsel, and it was sent care of the Old Bailey, but then it was passed on to Hare Court, where he was at the time. So, Godfrey Russell Vick had recently passed judgment on a man for carrying out a burglary during a blackout. And this is 1939. So the letter was forwarded to Russell Vick's chambers, and the postal mark furthest left shows that the letter was posted in Chiswick on the evening of the 29th of September 1939. It's written in inked capitals. Now, often when people wanted to write poison pen letters, they disguised their handwriting in some way. They wrote with their left hand if they wrote with their right hand. They wrote in block capitals. They didn't leave any spaces between their words. They didn't use any grammar, for example. And in fact, in Penning Poison, I look quite a lot at how you have to have a lot of cultural capital. You have to have a lot of penmanship. You have to have a lot of ability to use writing to actually disguise your writing so it looks like you're less literate than you are. Okay, so the letter opens. Your words when sentencing a man to 5 years penal servitude was filthy, stinking hypocrisy. You welcome crime to live and make crime by supporting capitalism. So reports had appeared in the newspaper that day when Russell Vick had sentenced Septimus Mills to 5 years for breaking into a property. Mills had various aliases and had convictions going back to 1891 when he'd stolen a pair of trousers belonging to a fellow trainee sailor. He was often described as having no fixed abode. When Septimus was 6 years old, his mother died, giving birth to a younger brother. So prison records flesh out our picture of Septimus Mills. We know that he had various tattoos, including clasped hands, including one of a ship. We know that he was just over 5 foot tall, and we know that by 1939 his brown hair was turning grey, but we don't know what provoked him to write this letter. We don't know what provoked him, sorry, to perform the crime that appeared in the newspapers that provoked the person to write the letter. So Septimus Mills's case was covered by newspapers right across the country, and clearly a person who picked up on that case took pen to paper and wrote capital letters to the judge. Russell Vick told Septimus Mills, "There is no doubt that you used the blackout for the purpose of carrying out crime, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm determined that it should be widely known to all the criminal classes that the punishment that will be given by the courts for offences committed during such a time in this country will be very heavy." So the letter was written by someone who either held Marxist or socialist views, or more likely, someone who was pretending to. The letter continued, "You are like the late shrivelled Avery rat who left £130,000. Now here the author is likening Russell Vick to Sir Horace Avery, another judge, a judge who appears in Penning Poison. Avery heavily steered the jury to acquit Edith Swan of writing poison pen letters in Littlehampton in 1923 in the final case against Edith Swan, because just like the judge before him in the earlier court case, he also could not square such behaviour with the seemingly respectable Edith Swan stood in the dock in front of him. The jury thought differently, and at that point Edith Swan, as we know, was found guilty. Avery had previously been involved in the notorious prosecution of Adolf Beck in 1896, and Adolf Beck was a man wrongly accused of a crime through mistaken identity. Many of the people who are convicted of writing poison pen letters after this time, after 1896, call on Adolf Beck as they say, "I'm another Adolf Beck. This is another situation of Adolf Beck." He's very well known. It's a very well known legal case. Continuing his commentary, his or her commentary, we have no idea whether this letter is written by a man or a woman. The author continued with a vein of anti-Semitism. They write, "You scum make crime to derive a living. May England lose the war and Hitler crush the Jewish and English capitalism. God damn you!" Exclamation mark. "You human bug," in inverted commas. "Heil Hitler, up Stalin!" Exclamation mark, exclamation mark. "May England get hers. The lower orders are no longer blind." And the final line written up on the left-hand side of the letter suggests that the writer thinks that she or he is writing on behalf of a wider group or the entire working class. And I look in Penning Poison at how people use this, the term "we," to make it look like they have a housing estate behind them, a whole street behind them, a whole community behind them. They're not just expressing the views of this one crank who is writing the letter, but they are expressing much more widely held community views. So Septimus Mills's sentence was later reduced on appeal, partly because it did create a lot of anxiety in the as a response. That was an extreme penalty. And so it was reduced on appeal to 2 years with hard labour, but he did actually commit further crimes and eventually died in Wandsworth prison, aged 69, before the end of the war. And again, let's square this circle and go right back to the first letter we looked at to start with, to Mary Dorothea Cockayne. Because again, the most peculiar aspect of this anecdote, this story, this letter that I'm telling you, is the fact that Russell Vick held on to this letter. Most letters like this were destroyed. Was he keeping it as some sort of strange keepsake? Was he keeping it in case other letters arrived? Is he keeping it as evidence? We don't know, and it's something that that I'd be quite interested to know more about. Why do people keep hold of letters like this that are imbued with negative feelings and negative energy? And finally, and my cat is actually circulating around, so he could actually even appear. So this could be an interesting form of timing for him. But I'd like to close with a letter that circulated on my own street in 2016, whilst I was researching penning poison in the midst of all this heated, fervid reading about other people's stories, about other secrets and hatred and dislike spread across streets. This letter arrived on my street, and so I have a copy of it here. And it made me think a lot about what it meant to be motivated, to write letters anonymously, but also to gauge some of the reactions to the letter on the street. And it reads, "Are you the owner, or do you know the owner of a black cat with a red collar? This cat is making our lives a misery." So those two are in bold. "3 times in the last week, this cat has come into our house in the evening and at night. It has left dirty paw prints down the wall where it jumps in, paw prints on our beds, waken children in the night and cause asthma attacks. We do not have a cat. Some of us have severe cat allergies, meaning we cannot breathe, and but if we are in a room where a cat is or has been, we rely on inhalers when we go near cats. Up until this last week, this cat has fished in our pond, chased the birds, eaten the food we put out for the birds, and used our garage and vegetable beds as litter trays, which is disgusting. We have put up with this. We cannot put up with the cat coming into our house. Regardless of whether or not we had cat allergies, we should be able to leave a window open without having to scrub and repaint walls, or change all the bed linen, or vacuum mop the house. We do not have time or money to take on this extra work which has come with your cat entering our house. We are writing to make you aware of the distress and damage this cat is causing. Please take whatever responsible steps are necessary to prevent your cat coming into our house again, for example, keeping it in at night and providing it with a litter tray." Now, it's not a bad letter. It's a polite letter. It doesn't make any threats. It suggests some possibilities about what you could do if you had this cat, or if you knew this cat. And it's very similar. I found, so this is 2016, and I found it was very similar looking at social media responses to letters like this that were tucked into people's cars, for example, during the pandemic, that said things like, "Why are you dressing up as a nurse and going out all the time? We know that you're not a nurse." And then I know in that case that the person who received it was a nurse, and thought, why are people paying so much attention to me? It made me think that lots of these letters, particularly the poison pen letters that the press got very interested in after 1910, were actually to do with the frustrations of living in very small communities and having the neighbours around you as your main focus of attention. Living in these very proximate small neighbourhoods, if you look at where the Littlehampton case played out, it's down a very narrow passageway. The Gooding house is in the garden of the house that's sort of side on to the Swan house. The Goodings would walk past the Swan house all the time. Walls are very thin. Everyone could hear everything. There's lots of sharing, the sharing of sheds, the sharing of equipment, the sharing of baths, the sharing of the paraphernalia of everyday life. Also, there's the opportunities for people to get upset by other people's animals, like the cat on the street in 2016. There are opportunities to get upset by people's bins that are smelly, by their waste left out too long, by bits of, and if we look at the Littlehampton case, sort of rabbits left behind, parts of fish boxes, parts of fishing tackle left behind. They had to crisscross each other's spaces all the time. They were really invading each other's privacies, but they were very much open to the secrets put out by other households. And this is what comes out in lots of these poison pen letters in these communities at the time, particularly the cases that that had very obvious female suspects or were proven to be written by women at the time. They're focused in these very claustrophobic, small, tight-knit communities that women, I argue, are quite bored of. They want to break out of it. And so they often would have written anonymous letters in order to wear the mantle of somebody else. To be, for example, in the case of one of the women in the chapter about the Weald in the 1910s and 1920s, she was called Molly Lee. She was a very, very respectable, very rich member of the community, but she wrote in her letters as though she was the member of a gang. She was a gangster's moll. She's clearly trying out some other life. I also found by looking at many of the letters written by the women at that time, these poison pen letters, that they had really traumatic childhoods that they were maybe trying to explore, or they had really traumatic experiences in their adolescence. And so I conclude in Penning Poison that I don't actually think these are manifestations of individual mental problems. I think that they're a response to communities that say things like women can't write anonymous obscene letters, women shouldn't say swear words, women shouldn't do this, for example, or that people in particular scenarios should or shouldn't behave in particular ways. I think if you put people into traumatic environments and difficult experiences, and you put them very squashed up close together without any privacy, then anonymous letters, and letters in some ways like this letter here that we had on the street in 2016, are a very obvious reaction to those annoyances of everyday life that make people feel unempowered, and it makes them feel like they're being attacked by, for example, other people's cats. Now, I have added in this slide a picture of my own cat, Kevin, who is circulating. I can see him on the fence out there. So he hasn't appeared in the film, unfortunately. And I've put him here in a picture of his red collar just for decorative purposes, because honestly, we did not have Kevin in 2016. So we were not the owners of the black cat with the red collar, if my neighbours are watching, because we didn't have Kevin then. Okay, so that is a sort of an account of the sorts of stories that I found in my book, for my book Penning Poison, and the stories that also led into the film, Wicked Little Letters. So do get hold of those at some point, and thank you very much for watching.